Is there one perfect story out there that's just objectively better than all the others? And if that story does exist, will it be written by an AI? It seems like a strange question, but the reason I'm asking is because that's exactly what happens in our episode's story. I'm Angus Stewart, and you're listening to the Translated Chinese Fiction Podcast. So if you know your Chinese sci-fi, you'll know that our story for this episode is by Fei Dao. It's the storytelling robot, and to discuss that story with me, I have as a guest Matt Michaelson from the Spectology podcast. You'll hear from him in a sec. Before we hear from him, I'd like to do not just the plugs, but also a little message to some, I guess, very special listeners. So I host this podcast on SoundCloud, and doing that gives me access to an app made by SoundCloud called Pulse, which gives me a lot of statistics about not just how many plays I get, but where my plays and downloads and whatnot are coming from. And it breaks it down, it can break it down by city and by country with little national flag emojis, which always amuse me. So I like to scroll through and have a look at the places that are getting smaller numbers of listens. So obviously places like London and the UK, US, they score high, but if I scroll down, I get to see where in the non-English speaking world people are listening. So I'd like to say hi to my listener in the city of Sulaymaniyah, I think it's pronounced, in Iraq. I know there's at least one of you. For you guys who hadn't heard of that, like me, until very recently. It's a city in the southern Kurdish region of Iraq. It's, according to Wikipedia, it's safe, it's relatively liberal, it's economically quite strong, and because of that it's got a fairly newish Chinatown with a population of 500 people, which leads me to surmise that my Iraqi listener is either Kurdish or Chinese or perhaps something in between, or connected to this Chinatown in some other way. If you're listening, I'd love to hear from you, my listener in Sulaymaniyah. I've also got at least one listener in Lima in Peru. Hello. And I know because of some attention the show got on Twitter and then corresponding stats on SoundCloud, I've got some new listeners in Japan. So hi, hello to you guys. Fantastic that you're listening, and I hope you stay with us as we go through this sci-fi season and beyond. And hi to all the new the North American listeners who come from some towns with very strange names. Moose Jaw in Canada. Hello to our listener in Moose Jaw, and in the US, Sugarland. That's not just me assigning a name to the whole country. There is actually a town in the States called Sugarland, which apparently houses one of my listeners. Yeah, that's that little spiel over. I'd been tweeting hellos to these people, but who's to say that they would see that? So I thought I'd say it on the podcast. The usual plugs, of course, would be that you can support the show through Patreon to get access to bonus content or one-off contributions on Buy Me a Coffee. Also, another plug, I've made a link tree page for the podcast, which you can find quite easily on the podcast Instagram account or my Twitter. And the link tree just bunches together all the relevant links for the show on one page in a very easy to click read format. So if you'd like to find a comprehensive list of everywhere where everything to do with this podcast exists, Linktree, linktree.com/TrChFic, TrChFic. That's the omni plug for all the other things I'd like to plug. Last little thing before we begin, we are maybe about midway through the TrChFic sci-fi season now. It's going really great. I've had more guests than I expected to have, and I'm getting a great reaction from listeners. So if sci-fi, Chinese sci-fi especially, is your thing, then do keep listening, because the next three episodes after this, if all goes according to plan, will also be about Chinese sci-fi and a different author every time, with some very cool guests, of course. So always excitement here on the show. I have definitely blabbed enough, so let us begin the interview with Mr. Michaelson of the Spectology podcast. So I'm on the show with Matt Michaelson, and he's one half of Spectology, the science fiction book club podcast. So name does what it says on the tin, I suppose. And Matt isn't just the show, he's also, as far as I can tell, he's a big China/Chinese literature / maybe even Chinese language buff. So Matt, spare me talking out my backside. Can you give us the elevator pitch for your podcast? And then bonus question, have you got a Chinese name?
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Matt. Like Angus pointed out, I'm half of Spectology, the science fiction book club podcast. The other half is Adrian, who is also very cool, although his interests and expertise lies elsewhere. So we are a podcast book club, so to speak. So every month we read a new book, and we have at minimum one episode that's a sort of pre-read before we read the book, where we talk about the kind of context of the book, what are some facts about the author, some facts about the genre, maybe what we think about this genre, what are our preconceptions, and so on, with no spoilers whatsoever. And then we definitely at least have a post-read episode where we go deep into the book, full spoilers, talk about all the details and what we thought about it and all those sorts of things. And typically we also have some kinds of other bonus episodes of various sorts. We've had a lot of guests, and we do interviews occasionally, and then we also do silly stuff, like we talk about things that we like in pop culture, or we recently had a bonus episode where we fan cast some books that we did, which, if you don't know, just means imagining that there's a film version of it and who would play who and who would direct and that sort of thing.
I know a book is good, a novel is good when I'm doing that in my head on my own as I read. It's always a good sign.
Oh yeah, I actually am. I always thought that I was sort of bad at that for some reason. Like I would like struggle with it, but then I found as soon as I was talking about it, it comes pretty naturally. A second about me, yeah. Also, because you asked, I like to think of myself as a sort of fan or a geek about literature and about China. I'm not like an academic expert or something like that. I was a Chinese major in university, and I studied a lot of Chinese for many years, and I lived in China for many years. And so I do know something about it, but I would never call myself an expert. So please take things that I say with a grain of salt, and, think of me as, the way I think of me is that I'm a fan, and I'm like sort of just like enjoying talking about it and having fun with it,
Well, the good thing is there are quite a lot of people who listen to the show. A lot of them are translators, and so they know the literary landscape, and they've done so-and-so Mandarin undergraduate degree or Asian studies degree or whatever. So if there's something I'm not sure of, I just ask the question into the mic, and enough people are listening now that a reply from an expert can materialize in one inbox or the other. So you can make use of that service as well. There are some
Excellent.
lovely people who would probably be able to answer these kind of questions.
Excellent. Actually, and your final thing, just real quick, I do have a Chinese name.
Oh, yes.
It's Mai Jiǎng, which was given to me by an old teacher.
Not just like Mata or something.
No. It's sort of a more Chinese-y sort of name. People have told me sometimes that it's a bit Tu sounding, which means it's a bit sort of, I don't know, rustic or country-ish.
Is that
countryside-ish?
Tu for earth?
Yes.
Earthy, an earthy name.
Yeah, that's a slang word that means it's occasionally used pejorative, so it's not necessarily a good thing to say. But
right. Well, nothing wrong with being in the countryside. So, on the topic of spectology and your 2-episode format, that's how this little guest spot for you's come about. Because I just wanted to see what else Waste Tide podcast related was out there after I put my episode up. So I typed Waste Tide into the search bar of my Player FM app. That's the slightly crappy app I use for listening to podcasts. And I think the only thing that came up was my own episode, and then Spectology's 2 Waste Tide episodes. So the pre-read and then the read. And the pre-read one is an excellent intro for people. I guess probably most of our listeners wouldn't need this, but if you wanted to put someone on to like all the background info you want before reading translated Chinese fiction, if you want to get a really good understanding of the context of these books, and also kind of the context of what can happen in translation from Chinese into English, Matt's explanations to Adrian, his co-host, are excellent. Just wanted to say that. But Thanks. Also on this show, I've talked a wee bit about how this show came about from me seeing what the podcast about China landscape is like out there on the internet. So do you have it? I'm sure you listen to lots of like books and literature podcasts. Have you got any favorite China podcasts that you listen to?
Yeah, I mean, I do love podcasts. What a surprise. I guess I sort of was thinking about this, and honestly, it's, the sub-China people who are the sort of Sinica is like the grand old podcast of like sort of the last 15 years, I guess. It hasn't been around that long. I don't know exactly how long, but not that long. Well, maybe I don't know. But it's a great podcast. Sinica is terrific. If you've never tried it, it's sort of an interview format there's a rotating cast of like the main two people are Jeremy Goldkorn and Kaiser Kuo.
Who's both have amazing voice, well, amusing voices.
Yeah, they're really interesting people in general,
That too, yeah.
aside from the podcast. But the podcast is terrific, and they have really, really high level, famous, interesting. They have a whole range of guests from like lots of different domains related to China, and everybody from like some of the most famous academics in the world to policymakers to tech entrepreneurs to artists. They had Chen Xiufan on at one point, actually, many years ago.
Ken Leo as well.
Yeah. So it's a terrific podcast. It covers a lot of different kinds of topics. It's an old school podcast, been around forever. Hopefully it'll stay around forever. And then Kaiser Kuo and Jeremy Goldkorn founded this company called SupChina, which also has a bunch of other podcasts about China. And many of them are also very good. The
Sinica Network, I think they call it.
Yeah. And in particular, like a thing that I liked recently was, I'm going to get it wrong. I think it's called the China Economic Podcast or something. I forget which one, but it's one of the SupChina podcasts.
Okay.
They did an interview with Peter Hessler. And if you don't know who Peter Hessler is, he is the author of Rivertown and Country Driving and Oracle Bones, which forms this sort of trilogy of nonfiction memoir books about his time in China. He's also a New Yorker contributor, longtime contributor, and the author of a bunch of amazing pieces and a book about Egypt. And he's basically like one of the great narrative nonfiction writers like in English today, I think. I mean, he's wonderful. He's a wonderful person to read. I really like all of his work. Long interview with him, highly recommended.
Yeah, I would say as well, if you've not listened to Sinica/SupChina before and Jeremy Goldkorn is on, you've got to make sure your volume's not too high because he occasionally blurts something really loud into the microphone. But that's part of the charm.
It very much is, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kaiser, I don't know if I have him as followed or added as a friend, but if you listen long enough and you like Kaiser, he posts interesting stuff on Facebook too. But not waffling on too long about that, I have a recommendation too for anyone who was interested in the Waste Tide episode or has read Waste Tide and wants to learn about the real stuff that's based on. South China Morning Post, which is a Hong Kong newspaper, which does a lot of good kind of mainland China stories. They have a podcast as well called Inside China, which I think they don't post new episodes that regularly. But they did a series of 4 just recently called China's Recycling Revolution. And if I was more prepared, I would have the topics listed and in front of me. And now I'm stalling to try and get them all. But there's one on Hong Kong. Am I going to get them in time? No. There's one on Hong Kong and Taiwan. There's one in about recycling in Shanghai. I think the first one is especially relevant to Waste Tide because it's about the dragon sword policy, where I think China started refusing certain kinds of waste from the developed economies of the world, i.e. mostly the West. And I think that had a bit of a knock-on effect in Southeast Asia, where they saw that you don't just have to accept the waste from all these countries. You can refuse it and then see where it goes. And supposedly, I saw in the episode description, that actually spurred some recycling, extra resources or focus or innovation in the States where they couldn't just send this stuff away. So they got better at recycling it. So an interesting topic. I got a literary podcast to recommend as well for listeners. And Matt, if you don't know this one, you might like it. It's nothing to do with this podcast at all. I just like it so much. It's called Weird Studies. And it's got these 2 rather strange American men, but they're very smart. And they talk about the weird fiction, which kind of stems from things like Lovecraft, old ghost stories by the likes of Arthur Machen. They talk about music a lot. One of them is a music academic. Things like David Lynch, the philosophy of walking, Gnosticism. I can't really do it justice, but that's a really interesting one. Matt, do you have any one literature podcast that you really enjoy that you could recommend?
Oh man, literature podcasts
or a book. Less fancy word, book podcast.
Well, it's funny because I actually don't. This is like a little weird, but I actually don't listen to literature podcasts all that often. My favorite kinds of podcasts tend to be sort of either history narratives or long form interviews. But I think Reading the End they're sort of friends of ours, and so I would definitely recommend that if you haven't heard of it. Reading the End is a podcast by the 2 Jennies, Whiskey Jenny and Gin Jenny. Okay. And they read books and they talk about them, and it's great. They read all kinds of books. There's no real sort of genre limitations, and they are very knowledgeable about publishing and the industry and about, I think, every aspect of the literature industry from the book to, to the companies. So it's a great podcast.
Fantastic. I do think for books, I find it to maybe be more suited in podcasting anyway, to read a book, stick the name of the book in search, and then find individual episodes by different podcasts. Because like if I was subscribed to your book club podcast and then 3 other book clubs, can't read all the books.
Right, of course.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
And from talking
That's the
to
problem
people
with
that,
books.
yeah, no, exactly. And I actually do the same thing. And I think from talking to people who listen to our podcast, a lot of folks will just listen to it without reading the book at all. And I actually find that I do that as well. Like I really enjoy parts of podcasts when they discuss books and they discuss literature. So like if, for instance, like the recommendation section at the end of a Seneca episode.
Yes.
That's always fun. And actually that reminds me, there is one other one that I think is people should know about if they don't, because it's so good. If folks haven't heard of the New Book Network, it's really, I think it's a pretty amazing thing. And in particular, of course, there's new books in East Asian studies. And then there's so what this is, the New Book Network is a network of a bunch of different podcasts that's produced by academics from a bunch of different, a sort of consortium of academics from a bunch of different disciplines, from a bunch of different universities. And all they do is highlight new academic work in a range of different fields. And if you sort of go to their website and look at the top, the bar of links to the different fields that they cover is enormous. It's like every sort of discipline you could imagine. And like all of them have their own podcast, and all of them talk about new interesting books that come out in that. So kind of whatever you're interested in. There's literature ones as well. And it's really fascinating. And what you can do, of course, is you can just kind of like scroll through the backlog and see if any of the names pop out at you, see if there's an interesting book. Yes. And they're all interviews with the authors. And it's just an amazing resource if you're interested in kind of exploring, like looking for sort of deep books about topics you don't know anything about, and like all that sort of thing.
Yeah, there was someone I spoke to at the Leeds Genre Fiction Conference I've mentioned in the past few episodes who'd hosted an episode on that, but I've completely forgotten who it was. But yeah, it's a good one. It's a bit of a lucky dip because you often get a different person on the microphone, and there's a really big range of stuff they cover. I'd love to talk more, but we're 25 minutes in and we're still talking about stuff we like to listen to online. So as you guys may have guessed, this episode's not just about waste tide and weird studies and East Asian studies academia. We've also got a story we're going to talk about, and that story's writer and its translation. So the story is The Storytelling Robot. Its writer is Fei Dao, and its translator is Alec Ash, one of the best alliterated names I've encountered. So Matt Michaelson, also of an alliterated name, how did you first encounter this story?
Well, I encountered it because I saw the translation on China Channel, which is a project that's done by the LA Review of Books. And that's also something highly recommended, about Chinese fiction and Chinese translated fiction on the internet, although it's not audio. Alec Ash is the editor of China Channel, the managing editor. And, he's a very interesting character in his own right who has a book out called Wish Lanterns, I think.
Yes.
And so I saw his translation of this story there, and I immediately sort of glommed onto it because it was science fiction. It sort of seemed like it was science fiction, and indeed it is. Although we can talk about, like, to what extent we think it.
I want to talk about that.
Yes. And so I immediately read the translation, and then it's a short story. And so I sometimes if it's a longer story, it will take me so long to read it in Chinese that I'll kind of put it off. But this is short enough that I went and I read the Chinese version, and which you can find online, although it's also appears in a collection of the same name. And then I looked up the author Fei Dao, and he seems like a really interesting author, and I read a couple of his other stories as well. And this is a type of story that I really like, and so I'm sure we'll talk more about the details of it. But yeah, this is a particular kind of science fiction or whatever you want to call it that I really like a lot, and so.
Yeah, we're going to talk a bit more about Alec Ash and Fei Dao and like them as individuals and their relationship or whatever. But I'll just say that in my mind, before I read this story, I associated Fei Dao and Alec Ash, like when I thought of them, it was as a pair. with the exception of the one little essay Fei Dao wrote on Chinese science fiction. I think it's called Chinese Sci-Fi Embarrassing No More. But apart from that, I just knew of these guys tied together as one thing, although we'll get more into that in a bit. So yeah, when you suggested that this was the story we could do for our episode, because some of the more superstar or more prominent translated Chinese sci-fi writers had been taken for other episodes.
Yeah, you know, I should say, you know, it's an honor to be among such illustrious company, you know.
Yeah, indeed. But you are one of the illustrious company now. So anyway, Liu Guangzhao said the same thing, and I had to keep reminding him that no, you're also as cool as these people. But yeah, as I was saying, I saw the name of this story, The Storytelling Robot, and I thought, wait a minute, this rings a bell. So I opened up my copy of Broken Stars, Ken Liu's anthology, and saw that there's a Fei Dao story called The Robot Who Liked to Tell Tall Tales. So immediately I thought, wait a minute, are these two different translations of the same source story? So I read the English versions side by side. So the Ken Liu Robot Who Liked to Tell Tall Tales on the page of the book, and the Alec Ash storytelling robot on my phone screen. And they were so different, I realized, or I kind of worked out, no, these can't be the same story. So there's two different stories by Fei Dao, both with a robot telling a story in the title. And I guess they concern themselves with a robot who tells stories. So my question for you is, have you read both these stories? Do you know anything about how they are or are not paired or connected in a deliberate or whatever way? And if you do know more, do you know more about Fei Dao having even more of these robot stories? So lots of questions there. Answer in any order you like.
Yeah, I do know a little bit about it. So I have read the other one. Those are the only two Fei Dao robot stories that I've read, but my understanding is that there are more. He has a sort of so I read this great interview with Fei Dao that I don't think has been translated into English, but I can get I can get you the link and you can, you know, check it out and like, you know, everyone is encouraged to check it out because it's a really, really interesting in-depth interview with Fei Dao from a couple of years ago. And the interviewer asks him a similar question. Ask him, you know, do you have sort of series of stories? Because it seems like some of your stories are sort of loosely thematically connected, almost like a Asimov robot stories or something like that. Mm-hmm. And he says that he didn't intend that to be the case, but it did sort of turn out that way. And so he does have this kind of like almost accidental series of robot stories. And I found that really, really interesting because, there's one other thing he says also about his creative process, which is not in answer to the same question, but I thought it was interesting. He says that he is a big fan of daydreaming and of just kind of losing yourself in thought and just kind of taking flights of fancy and seeing where your mind goes. And that's the sort of writing that he loves to make and to do. And
indeed,
you know, if you read his stories, you'll see how that makes a lot of sense. You know, and he is kind of he kind of expresses a little bit of ambivalence about, you know, what that means for the sort of like larger significance of his writing, but he also thinks that sort of writing, that sort of like fantastical you know, journey of imagination, like, you know, he gives this example of a daydream, you know, like, I wonder, what if the heavens had a physical form and like they actually fell, like the sky is falling style, and there was something that had to like catch them and hold them up. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just like you're sitting there looking out at the you know, trees outside, and you're just kind of wondering these random things, and he makes these stories out of that. And
shower thought sci-fi.
Yeah, exactly. And so he sort of talked about his process in that way, and I thought that was interesting. And then the other thing that I think about with regard to his robot stories is that he mentions that the first one of them, which I'm not sure which one was first, but that he wrote first. The first one that he wrote was inspired by him reading a foreign sci-fi author. He says foreign sci-fi author. And in the interview, he doesn't remember who this person was. But in the foreign sci-fi story that he read contained both kings and robots, he says. And that was like a pairing that he found really evocative, and so he wrote his own story. And I think, you know, as soon as I read the first of his stories, the first thing I thought of was Stanislaw Lem, and in particular the Siberiad, which is a book of short stories that Stanislaw Lem wrote about robots that also has kings in it.
Okay.
And they're sort of like fairy stories about robots and technology. If you don't know Stanislaw Lem, he's a Polish. He's no longer alive. He's a Polish science fiction author from the 20th century who lived in communist Poland for most of his life. And he wrote, among other things, the book Solaris, which was made into a couple of movies.
Ah, right. Okay.
Yeah, and but he's an amazing author. His books are amazing. He's one of my favorite authors, and so it makes sense that I would think of one of my favorite authors if there's any similarity at all. But actually, I think it's really similar.
You may
so
have
I wonder,
solved the mystery. Yeah.
I wonder. I'm not sure. I can't be sure. Stanislaw Lem also has other books about robots, in particular Mortal Engines. So I, maybe one of those or one of the stories in them. And anyway, a lot of different different thoughts about the different questions.
Well, Alec Ash, if you're listening, zap Fei Dao a message and see if Matt's right, because I think you might be onto something there. And it's cool that this. Did Stanislaw, did he write in Polish? Do you know?
Yes, he
Or
did.
Was he writing?
So I know that he's been translated into Chinese.
Right.
But what's interesting to me is the Stanislaw Lem is known for his sort of formal experimentation with literature, as well as for his sort of very imaginative like visuals and plots and characters. And he was an incredibly brilliant person and a polymath interested in lots of different things. And so his writing tends to be very, very, like I don't know Polish, but I've read that it's extremely difficult to translate. And the person who did the most famous English translations of, for example, the Siberiad, but also other books, was a PhD in Slavic studies.
Right.
And I read a little of some of the Chinese translation of one of the Siberiad stories just because I was curious about this. And my impression is that the Chinese translation, at least the one that I saw, was nowhere near as good as the English translation from Polish that I saw. And so that's an interesting, I really wonder about that, because it seems like very difficult stuff to translate, mainly because like Stanislaw Lem invents a lot of words, and he kind of has all these sort of puns involving like scientific terminology. And like he does these like very subtle satires of academic speak and stuff like that. And that stuff's like super hard to, I don't even know how the guy who did it into English did it. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah, I think that might be a thing. If Liu Guanzhao is listening, this might be something he knows about, because he's specifically quite a sci-fi expert, whereas myself, not really, just kind of a casual occasional reader. And I think most of our listeners are probably in the same boat. But Liu Guanzhao, if you're listening, if you can if you can give us a little bit of insight about Stanislaw in Chinese, that would be fantastic.
Oh, I would love to learn more about that. That would be so cool. Yeah, please.
Yes, quite an interesting rabbit hole. Moving swiftly on, however, let's talk a bit more about the story of the storytelling robot. So could you tell us in a nutshell what it's about?
All right, it's a sort of a fable, and it concerns an unnamed king in an unnamed country who loves listening to stories, and he kind of runs out of stories that he always wants to hear a new story that he's never heard before, and like the various courtiers and people of learning who are providing him with stories eventually kind of cease to satisfy him, and so he has commissioned a robot that will be a better storyteller than any of the sort of people who have failed him. And his court scientists build this robot, this storytelling robot, and it is like a learning robot. It sort of starts out not being particularly good at telling stories, but it gets better and better and better, and till finally it's better than any person. And it is able to satisfy the king with its stories, and all the other people, in the kingdom kind of are able to relax because the king is kind of an asshole when he is not satisfied with his latest story. But at some point, the king demands of the robot that the robot sort of, I forget exactly what happens. There's some moment where the robot is like temporarily unsatisfying, and so the king demands of the robot that it tell him the most magnificent story in the world. And
I think it's because the stories are starting to get a bit stale or repetitive, or he's beginning to, you know what I mean?
He can guess what's going to happen or something. Yeah. No, you're right. And so he demands, he issues this new command to the robot: tell me the most marvelous story in the world. And I guess I'm sort of going through the entire plot of this story, but it's not a very long story. And I encourage everybody to check it out, because it's really very short and it's a great read. And if you like it, you can move on to the other the other story that Angus mentioned. So he issues this command to the robot, and the robot sort of pauses and like has to work a little harder because now it's trying to make the best story ever. And it starts telling the story, and it's amazing, and everybody's like enthralled. And it gets to the part that sort of seems like it's going to be the climax, and then the robot says, "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, there are two equally likely like endings to this story, and I cannot determine which is more marvelous," or something like that. And
yeah,
and the king says, the king demands that the robot just like pick one. Like he gets tired of waiting. The robot kind of is like calculating and sort of sitting there calculating silently, trying to figure out which is the more marvelous ending. And the king just gets tired of this and sort of demands that he just tell him any which one of them. And the robot says, "Well, but Majesty, your previous command was that I must give you the most marvelous story, and this new command is like contradictory." And so the robot kind of shuts down.
Yeah.
It like has been issued two contradictory commands and like and can't keep operating. And so it sort of it doesn't die, but it shuts down and it crashes. And then the scientists have to like sort of fix it, and the king's like, what happened? And the scientists explain it's you gave it two contradictory commands. You can't do that, Your Majesty. Like if we were to unspool what had happened and like revert back to a previous state of the robot, then we would also lose the story that was so marvelous that it was telling. We'd have to delete that in order to unspool it back to a previous state. And so, the only thing we can do, Your Majesty, is we can just sort of caution you not to like ask it about this again, but we can turn it back on and it'll just tell you other stories and we'll go back to that. And that was pretty satisfying, right? That'll be okay, right? And the king's like, I guess. And
that's what he says.
Direct quote. And so it goes back to that, and the king, is grudgingly accepts that, and sort of the robot begins telling stories again, and years pass in this way, and the king grows old, and eventually the king falls ill, and right before he falls ill, actually, the king is an old man, and he asks the robot at one point, he sort of softens in his old age, and he asks the robot at one point, "Did you ever figure out which was the better ending of that story?" And the robot says, "I still didn't, Your Majesty." And the king says, "It's too bad. Well, that's all right." And then that very night, the king falls ill in bed and sort of never recovers and dies. And the robot says, as the king is ill, the robot says, "I actually think there might be a third ending to the story." And the king says, no, that's all right, and he sort of passes away. And in the king's will, he accounts for everything, in his life very carefully, except the robot isn't really carefully accounted for. Like the robot is it's not specified exactly what to do with the storytelling robot in the king's will. And so the king's heir decides that the king's heir doesn't really care for stories. He's more of a sports guy, or something. He's an action character. He likes going outside and doing things. And so he decides to honor the old king's memory. The storytelling robot will be put in the museum, and no one will be allowed to use it anymore forever. And no one will ever know the ending that the storytelling robot had decided, or the third ending, or which of the first two was better, or any of those. And then, of course, I guess maybe I've told you everything else about this story, so I could tell you the very ending, perhaps. What do you think?
Yeah, where that train has left the station, you may as well.
Yeah, I may as well. The very ending of the story the story ends with the line, and that is all, Your Majesty. Or I forget what the line is exactly, but there's this line that the robot always uses to end its stories to the king.
Yeah.
And that's how this story ends, with that line.
Yeah, it just occurred to me that the bit at the end where the robot's put in the box was reminding me, it was giving me some half-remembered image, and I've remembered what it is. Do you know the philosopher Jeremy Bentham?
Yes.
And you know where his body is now?
No, where is it?
Oh, this is such a good story. I'm so glad you don't know. At his own request, he had his body preserved. I forgot what the word is, what they do to taxidermied, the thing they do to animals. Yeah, that is taxidermy.
Yeah, that is taxidermy, yeah.
Yep.
Wow.
He had his body taxidermied and put on display in a cabinet in the University College of London, which I think is where he taught.
Unreal.
And it's still there. I visited it just earlier this year. Paid a wee pilgrimage.
Wild. What was it like to see it?
Well, I'd seen it in pictures before. It was
believable.
I'd been making a point to see lots of weird things in London, so it felt like par for the course by that point. But It's pretty cool. It didn't freak me out. It was the day I showed up seemed to be an open day for overseas students, so quite a lot of what looked like young Chinese students were walking around and just kind of passing by this dead philosopher, one of the greatest philosophers, just dead and in a cabinet in one of the halls.
That is absolutely wild.
Yep. So that's what the
Wow.
the end of the storytelling robot reminded me of.
Wow.
But I didn't really get an awful lot of deep thoughts about the story. But apart from the really obvious one that it's meta, it's a story about stories, and it's got a bit of a fable-esque setting and tone. And I felt like if it's about anything, it's maybe about what stories are, what they do. So to say that in a more pretentious way, the nature and function of stories, more about that, what stories do for us than it is about what science or robots do for us. Did you get a similar feeling, or do you have a different take on it?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I agree with you completely. I think it's very much about what stories are like and what stories do for us, and what the point of telling stories is. Um, but I think maybe it's just because I love stories like this, these sort of science fables, I guess. And I also love like sort of actual fables and weird stories and fantasy stories. And I think, I think there's a weird way that by combining these sort of like, I don't know, like words, by combining words that are usually taken to refer to scientific things and super realistic and precisely specified things, and combining those words with fantasy tropes and a fantasy plot and the form of a fantasy story, it kind of almost gets you to think about the scientific ideas in a new way. Like the robot that's described here is a robot that learns, and it sort of, in that sense, kind of makes one think about a lot of the actually existing machine learning technology in the world, and yet because it's the form of a fantasy story, and because it just kind of, I don't know, I found myself provoked to think about science in a different way, exactly because it was this weird juxtaposition between scientific ideas and like completely what are typically thought of as totally unscientific ideas, which is, I don't know, I mean, maybe I'm just like in my head way too much. And I'm like,
I think that's where Fei
thinking
Dao
about
wants you
this
to be.
too much, but
Yeah.
it's very possible. I'm just thinking sort of too much about this and putting stuff into it that comes from, me. It doesn't come from the story, but
Well, again, if a story makes you do that, it's a sign of a good story.
I hope so. Yeah. But I thought, in particular with the learning, the way the robot learns and the way that the robot. So there's one moment that I really like, which is the scientists are talking. The robot kind of accepts these contradictory commands and then shuts down. And the scientists are trying to explain this to the king, and they tell the king that look, the robot is like has learned so much that it's actually too complicated for us to understand how it works anymore. And that's a real phenomenon in the creation of machine learning algorithms. Like it really is true that when you simulate a function, when you learn a function, you can learn a function. Like, okay, when you try to train a neural network to
Can you tell us really quickly what's a neural network?
Yeah, so a neural network there are lots of different kinds of neural network, but like at a high level, a neural network is a type of algorithm that's designed to learn a mathematical function, which is a fancy way of saying it's designed to like approximate something.
Right.
And an example of this would be a computer program that can tell the difference between two images, that can say this image is an image of a cat, this image is an image of a dog, something like that. There are lots of different algorithms that can do similar things, but a neural network is one type of algorithm that tries to like approximate a function, which might be able to determine whether something is one thing or another thing, or
And they tend to use fuzzy logic like we use rather than strict logic to put it in a very like baby language kind of way, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what fuzzy logic is, to be honest, but
Well, they
I
work
think that
more
makes
like
sense.
like a human brain. They don't need to follow really strict rules like a traditional
That is very true.
program.
Exactly. Yeah, because what they do is they make them, they sort of they progressively improve themselves. They start out perhaps as a weak approximation, and by comparing examples of correct answers to the thing that they're trying to approximate, They progressively become a better approximation over time. And the only thing that the human sort of specifies, the human programmer, is sort of how the improvement of the approximation is going to work. The human programmer doesn't specify what the eventual approximation is going to be. And so what you end up with is, in a lot of cases, the eventual approximation becomes incredibly complicated, and there is no human being that wrote it. And there is no human being that might be able to even say what it means, like how it works, because all that humans done is sort of told it how to improve itself. It's almost like you have a pet or something, and you want to train your pet to be better. And so you sort of give it a treat whenever it does the thing. You don't know how Spot knows how to shake, right? You don't know how your pet dog knows how to like shake. You don't know like what's going on in its head, but you're the one who's kind of trained it to do that. You know what I mean? So the scientists are in the position of the trainer, where they don't know how it is the robot is able to be so good at telling stories. They don't know, like, even if they look at its code, they don't know what it means. So I don't know. I mean, it's a true thing, basically, that even though it's a fable, even though the story has like, the story is sort of like maybe wasn't even intending to be true. It's not clear that that Fei Dao was like trying to write this, like, make that line, a true comment on the nature of like machine learning or something like that. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. I don't know.
Well,
but
he seems to like robots, at least for whatever purpose. So he might know a bit about this stuff. Yeah,
it's possible. But I just found that by making that point, I mean, it's just like I don't know. It's sort of, it's like how when you read a fairy tale and like the evil king, sends his soldiers to every home in the land to check if they, check if there's like the prophesied hero has been born yet or something like that. When something like that happens in a story, on the one hand, it's like, okay, that could be a good story. On the other hand, maybe it reminds you of the census. And there's like this real thing that maybe we should think about in a certain way, because the story reveals something in our minds about how it actually affects us. I don't know. I'm being very long-winded. And
no, I get it. I think the listeners will get it too.
I hope so.
Yeah. And if they didn't, they learned something about neural networks, which is also a plus. My take on the I guess about the robot and how it changes, it makes me think of two things. One is, first of all, the robot in this story and the other Fei Dao robot story, it's a robot that does what they are supposed to do. They serve humans and they're very helpful. He's not writing a robot's gone bad kind of end of the world story. I think that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but I think it's a thing that doesn't shove itself in your face whilst you're reading the story. But I think it gives the kind of more calm, relaxing feel to the story, that it's not about evil robots. It's maybe more optimistic about what robots could do for us in that sense. But also to what you said about the robot's program or neural network evolving, it made me think about the meta aspect, that it's the stories that give the robot kind of a capacity to be more human, or be more like a human, because we're told its brain evolves in complexity, and we're told that it's able to feel pain. I can't remember what sort of pain, and I don't have the story in front of me, but it also is able to respond correctly to the king's moods and establish, I guess, what you call it on like a normal, positive human relationship with him after the king stops asking about the perfect ending to the story. And like if I'm doing a little bit more of a reach, the king gets a bit more human too, or he at least calms down and stops being so binary. Like you need to tell me one story or the other. And we're also told the robot is the king's only friend. So I don't know if there's anything deep there, but I think that's the other side to the robot becoming more complicated. It mirrors neural networks and their approximation of, I don't know, either being more effective or emulating the way we think. But on an emotional or psychological level, the robot also gets more human. I think that's an interesting thing.
I think that's a great point. I love that. I wasn't thinking about that, but I think you're onto something there.
And I think your point and mine, they're intertwined, or two sides of the same coin, or whatever. Another thing that I think is fairly obvious about the story is that it's got, like you said, the science fiction elements, but it's also got fantasy elements. But if you're looking at it from a how Chinese / how international angle is the story, that's kind of my little obsession. I love looking at what domestic things are in the stories I do on the podcast, but also what kind of globalized or borrowed things are there too. So in this story, at least in the English version, it felt like there was elements from medieval Europe, at least to me, and maybe some things from imperial China too. So there's the king, there's the court. I can't think of more specific examples, but do you think that's a good description of the story, that it's got medieval European stuff and imperial historical Chinese stuff?
Yeah, I do. I really do. I think one of the ways that I think about this, if anyone's ever listened to Spectology, they know that I like, bring up annoyingly often the like sort of lineages of stories, like the sort of things that they draw upon from the past. So, in science fiction, obviously, stories like Frankenstein or A Journey to the Center of the Earth, sort of older science fiction, or even older science fiction than that, casts a long shadow, and a lot of things draw on it. And so I love the sort of histories of these sorts of things. And I think, like, definitely there's stuff like whatever the foreign story that inspired Fei Dao was. There certainly was such a story, according to him. And so there's definitely this, like, I think, Western idea or set of ideas that's coming into it that way. And Fei Dao's also said that he's certainly a fan of other kinds of European science fiction or Western science fiction or things like that, and he studies science fiction.
Yes.
So I think there's definitely going to be some sort of foreign influences, even if you kind of can't see them directly. I think you can see them directly, but there's certainly also there. And then as far as the Chinese stuff, I think China has a really long tradition of strange stories, or I don't know. There's a lot of ways you could there's different names for them in Chinese, and there's different ways of translating the names into English, but there's sort of fables or weird stories or philosophical fables or, things like that go back all the way in Chinese literature.
Yeah.
And everybody is aware of them. I mean, any sort of student of any sort of Chinese student in China will have read some of these. Everything from zhuangzi, and old Taoist and philosophical stories about, people may have heard of the one where,
Butterfly?
He was wondering, Master Hui was wondering if he dreamed himself a butterfly, or if he was a butterfly dreaming himself a person. That the stories like that. There's a lot of other stories from zhuangzi that are sort of these like philosophical fables that are short, and yet they kind of have this core of trying to like touch on deep and important themes in human life without having like one moral or one point. So they're very like open to interpretation, kind of like this story is. And then there's like much more recent things, but like still hundreds of years old, like Pu Songling's Tales from the Strange Tales from the Studio. I don't remember how it's translated in Chinese. It's called
Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio. Yeah,
there's a great Penguin edition of it in English, and stories like that are very well known in China, and there's a lot of, some of them are ghost stories, some of them are sort of horror-ish, and others of them are just kind of like very strange things happen in different settings. And I think there's a subtle element of that. I mean, in some ways this almost feels more European-y, this story, but there's still a subtle element of that in there too.
Yeah. What you were saying about the zhuangzi and stuff. So the other robot story, the robot who liked to tell tall tales, so I've read years and years ago. It was before I went to live in China and before I was a China obsessive. But I'd read him. What was it? The Tao of Pooh, and the
I know
books.
that book. I've read that book.
And the sequel, the Tale of Piglet. So I wasn't necessarily interested in Chinese stuff. It was just, what on earth is this black and white symbol? How's that a religion? And obviously, I know now that I think the book emphasizes as well that Taoism and Chinese folk traditions are inextricable. But anyway, it ended up with me downloading a PDF of the Tao Te Ching, and my experience reading The Robot Who Liked to Tell Tall Tales did cast my mind back with like the kind of how it's like some very short nuggets of fables, how kind of strange, quirky traveling characters bump into each other in different scenarios. think that there's two bits in that story where someone's sitting by a river or a lake fishing, just stuff like that. So I feel like the elements you described are maybe more in that story than in Storytelling Robot. But yeah, I think you're on something there for sure.
Yeah, there's one. I think you're right about that for sure. There's one other. There's so many different. I think people often bring up strange tales from Chinese studio and other stuff like that. But there's also there's so many other sorts of stories that that exist in like the history of Chinese literature that kind of are brought up a little bit less often. And one of my favorite kinds of those is they're called 传奇, Tang 传奇. And it's a genre of sort of short story that involves strange or miraculous things happening.
Okay.
And it's from, really associated with the Tang Dynasty, but people wrote them after that too. And the Strange Tales collection includes some things that are called 传奇. But it's
now, yeah. Sorry, go on. Keep going. I'm searching for something online.
Oh yeah. So those stories are they have different sort of genre implications. Like some of them are like, more realistic than others. Some of them have like a ghost. Some of them only have sort of a miraculous seeming event. Some of them have references to like exotic foreign things that seem to have magical powers of some kind or another.
Yeah.
And I was thinking actually there's this one 传奇 called Kunlunu, which is about a foreign. It's so the title character is a slave that is kept by a Chinese person, and the slave ends up saving him. And the slave reminded me a little of a robot. I mean, and there's so many things to talk about with that because it's very complicated for racial reasons and because the slave is not Chinese, the slave is foreign.
Would that be like a northern barbarian or a western barbarian or
the
something?
The slave is actually described as having dark skin and probably, yeah. And so it's complicated. Some people have said that they think it's from Southeast Asia or even South Asia or somewhere else perhaps.
Sounds like a can of worms.
It is. But in any case, that story, it reminded me a little bit of it because the way the story works is the slave almost like functions like a robot in the story. Like the slave is the sort of only friend of this Chinese person and ends up saving him from certain death. And I don't know, it's maybe a bit of a stretch, but I guess the point is that I think you can make these connections to like strange pieces of Chinese lore, and there's all this sort of soup of like interesting older Chinese literature out there that people in the West may have not heard as much about that kind of is like the submerged part of the iceberg of Chinese literature. And yeah.
Now that you've mentioned that, there is a podcast out there which is about all of this stuff. Have you heard of the Chinese Mythology podcast?
No, I haven't.
You should subscribe to this. So it's hosted by Yang Li and Eric Parfit. So I think they're a married couple. Obviously, Yang is she's the wife. She's Chinese. I guess Eric, I think he's an American. And she basically, in like average kind of 5-minute length, sometimes slightly longer episodes, she just tells him one of these strange stories, and they usually remark on how strange it is. And a lot of them have like a magic or a horror thing. I've not listened. What are they on now? Because it's so short. They're now on episode 204. It looks like they do roughly 2 a week. So if anyone is intrigued by these strange stories that Matt was describing and either doesn't know where to find them or like me would need them in English, this podcast has summaries and descriptions of the stories. Not readings, but it's quite funny as well. Sometimes Eric gets totally bemused and confused and befuddled, and sometimes Yang has an explanation, other times she just laughs along with him. So it's quite an amusing show.
Sounds great.
Especially if you like little short nugget episodes. I prefer long ones. So keeping waffling to a minimum, here's a quote, something the translator Alec Ash wrote about Fei Dao. This is in the introduction to Fei Dao's An End of Day story. I think it's on China Channel, but if you want some accompanying art, it's on paperrepublic.org. A really good, really good website we've mentioned on a previous episode of the show. So this is going to be me reading a big block of text. I apologize if anyone gets bored, but I think it paints an interesting picture of Fei Dao. So here we go. This is Alec Ash's writing. I first met Fei Dao at Paper Republic's Christmas party in 2012. He was a scrawny male geek Tsinghua student in specs who wrote science fiction, a recognizable type. I'm a closet sci-fi fan myself, and we became friends. When he sent me a couple of his stories, I was immediately taken by his style, more fairy tale than techno nerd. I could picture his childhood in a coal town in Inner Mongolia, nose buried in a copy of Science Fiction World magazine while everyone else played basketball. Now he has 4 books of collected stories and is writing in a golden age of Chinese sci-fi. This fable was a delightful challenge to translate, infused with both quiet humor and a deep melancholia. The vanishing population reminded me of political disappearances in China, but Fei Dao insists it's a story about death. Trust the tale, not the teller, open brackets, or translator, close brackets. So that's the end of the quote. I kind of got the feeling from this description from Alec Ash that Fei Dao might be a little bit of a kindred spirit, maybe for himself and maybe for me when I'm feeling particularly gloomy. Storytelling robot is a little bit melancholy, and death is in there. The other robot story, Robot Who Tells Tall Tales, is really kind of existential, asking existential questions. There's a lot of hope versus despair. Death is a character as well as a key theme, and he's not a friendly version of death like Discworld. He is a bit of a grim version, and there's kind of sadness infused with a bit of a smile. It reminded me, out of the other Chinese sci-fi I've read, it reminded me a little bit of Jiǎng's stories, Thousand Ghosts.
Totally.
Yep, Thousand Ghosts Parade Tonight, Tong Tong Summer, Goodnight Melancholy. So my question for you is an emotional question, Matt. Do you feel Fei Dao's sadness or his loneliness or even his optimism?
Yeah, I think I do. I mean, as I said, I love stories like this, and I was also reminded of the Xiajia stories you mentioned, because her writing also has this kind of melancholy, especially the one like A Thousand Ghosts, where it's this sort of like the ghost street is like dilapidated ruin, and her other one with the horse dragon, the dragon horse. Which one is that?
Yeah. I think it's called Horse Dragon or Dragon Horse.
Yeah.
I'd forgotten, but yeah, that is melancholy too.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel it. I think my partner makes this point sometimes, that and I say this too much on air because people are probably tired of hearing it if they've ever heard me talk before. But it's important to kind of feel the full spectrum of emotions in life, and when you read, she likes to say, mix happy and sad in the right ratio. Don't only read happy things. Don't only read sad things. Either of those will be bad. Mix it in the right ratio, and then you'll be all right. So.
Yeah, I think I said when Xiajia was at the Leeds genre thing. So when I went up to Qian Fan, I told him, "Hi, my favorite thing I've read by you is was Year of the Rat. That was one of my favorite stories in Invisible Planets." And I spilled my guts a bit more to Xiajia. I said, "Hi, Xiajia. Just want to say only 2 things of Chinese sci-fi ever made me cry, or any 2 things of sci-fi full stop ever made me cry. One was the bit at the end of Death's End with the names of certain things on a screen. I won't spoil that for anyone. And your story, Tong Tong Summer. And if I was to meet her again, or if I was to speak to her again, which is podcast subscribers take note, if I do speak to her again, I'll need to tell her Goodnight Melancholy got the waterworks going." And the reason I mention this is I think it's harder for, at least for me, films make me cry quite a lot. Not as a kid, but as an adult, stuff in film, I suppose, because as an adult, real life, you're dealing with real life and difficult things, and when they're in films, they get me quite easily, get the waterworks going. Stories usually don't. So in this case, Fei Dao did not get me, but I think your partner's got a good point. You can get both from life and from stories, and a little bit of sadness doesn't hurt.
Yeah, definitely. And I think if anyone checks out this very short story, I like I said before, I really do encourage you to check out the other one that Angus mentioned, the Robot Who Tells Tall Tales, because it's almost like a longer and more in-depth and more emotionally intense kind of exploration of very similar stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. Very good. And
yeah.
I can't say enough how great I think Xiajia's stories are. If folks haven't read her, they should.
Yep. and she's in her story. You can find a lot of her stories online in different places in English, and she's in both of the Ken Liu anthologies, Invisible Planets and Broken Stars. So yes, heartily recommended, along with all the other stories in those books. I'm going to mention the website a little later, but what you said about a robot who tells tall tales having similar ideas about stories. So the robot who liked to tell tall tales, such a hard one to say aloud. The translation by Ken Liu originally appeared on the Clarkesworld website as just a web page, and you can see what people commented below. If you click reveal comments, you can see the commenters, and one of them said something like, it was one of these things where it's a big long criticism, and then at the end, by the way, I really like the story. And the criticism was obviously someone who lives a life of the mind. They're like, I can't really like this. I can't agree with this story because of its view of storytelling, that stories are just a distraction and it's nihilistic, and I don't agree with nihilism. And on one hand, I was like, okay, person, you're a bit too in love with yourself. But on the other hand, maybe they're onto something. Maybe Fei Dao is a bit of a nihilist. Although if he is a nihilist, he seems to be someone who is prepared to argue against. This isn't really stuff that's in Storytelling Robot. This is more in Robot Who Tells Tall Tales. But if you like stories that... nihilist is a strong word, but if they deal with optimism, pessimism, existential questions, that seems to be one of Fei Dao's themes, at least in these two things I've read. And no, that's not true. I've read an End of Day story as well, and it's also death, 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 what's it all for? So, yeah. On that note,
yeah. This is more of a comment than a question, but
go on.
No, I'm just imitating people who ask questions at events who are very long-winded and have nothing to say.
Well, I do that on the podcast. I yak, and the guest is like, what's he going to say? And at the end, I go, well, that wasn't really a question.
I do that too. I don't know how you avoid doing that in life. Yeah. But
it's okay. Sorry, what is your non-question?
No, that was honestly just a joke. But it did. I was reminded when you were talking of another bit from the interview with Fei Dao that I read, where he talks about the purpose of storytelling. And he does seem to feel very ambivalent about it. You know, he kind of on the one hand struggles with whether his stories in particular are sort of worth anything, because the way he thinks of them is that they're not like, they don't come to him with this like moral purpose in mind. They just sort of come to him, or he likes thinking about them or something like that. But then, you know, I think he kind of, although he struggles with the ambivalence, he seems to, I mean, you know, please, someone who either is Fei Dao or knows Fei Dao better than me, correct me if this is a poor interpretation of his words. But my impression was that he kind of feels at the end like he has no choice. Like he just, the stories are there one way or another. And it's kind of like in this story, you know, at the end of the story, you know, the robot never does tell you what happened at the end. But it's also, and so like on some level, it didn't matter. Like that story, that most marvelous story in the world, was like irrelevant because it never ended. But on another level, it was the main. It was like it was sort of central to the character evolution of the king and of the robot itself, and it was kind of a big part of their relationship, which was worth something. And I think if you think about it, you know, in terms of your own life as a reader, I mean, you know, maybe a story can't bring someone back from the dead or cure an illness or bring peace to a conflict. But nonetheless, I mean, we need them, and we kind of wouldn't know what to do without them. And even if and as one of the things I thought from the other story, the robot who loves to tell tall tales, it's almost like whether you think you're telling a story or not, you are. So there's really no other alternative.
Yeah, I think the power of stories comes in either them being used as a reference for something in reality, or just having a conversation about it with someone else, or a film adaptation being made of the story. That helps too. But last thing I'm going to say before we got into technical questions, I meant to say this earlier, about a point about the two possible endings and both of them being equally good, and the fact that being equally good makes them equally true in the sense that they're both the best. That seems like a bit of a very obvious sci-fi pointer to quantum states, Schrodinger's cat. But again, maybe there's nothing deeper than that. I don't know. Do you have any? Did that thought present itself to you as you were reading?
I thought about, I mean, in a way, yes, because I thought about how the robot isn't like that isn't the end. Like the robot then later is sort of like, I actually thought of a third one, which
That's true.
I love. I love that. I love the like, oh, I think there's an unstoppable force about to meet an immobile object, and
Yeah.
it's impossible to say which will win. I think there's a paradox, but actually there's a third thing.
Yep. The only way to avoid that is to kill Heath Ledger. Dark jokes. On that note, technical questions. It's simple. We kill Heath Ledger. Technical questions. So, unlike me, you're fluent in Mandarin, and since you're not a Chinese author, I don't have to feel guilty about pestering you with kind of language-related questions. So, I forget. You said you'd read this story in Chinese, right? Because it's nice and short. Okay, so I have 4 translation-related or language difference-related questions. What's this story's Chinese name, and is it identical to the English, or is there any subtle differences?
That's a good question. It is identical. It's 讲故事的机器人, so it's the same. Yeah.
Okay, storytelling robot, and there's king. So I know you can say king kind of more than one way in Chinese, because the character I know is Wang, which means emperor. And then there's Guo Wang, which I guess you might use as king instead of emperor, perhaps. How's he named in the Chinese version?
Yeah, he's called Guo Wang. And
Okay.
Yeah, and I think, there's in general, the way that these are really good questions, because it's sort of like you could imagine the Chinese working in a lot of different ways. But the way that this story was written in Chinese, it's very much like, in some ways, it's sort of a lot like a translation of a European story into Chinese, although it isn't. Because a lot of the terminology is kind of, it avoids using a lot of specific medieval Chinese terminology for things like this. Like it does not use it could have used like a term for emperor, and it could have used various terms for courtiers and like court officials and storytellers that are associated with like Chinese history or specific historical eras. But instead it uses this sort of like modern standard Mandarin terminology for things. And a lot of modern standard Mandarin actually comes from European languages. A lot of the like standard Mandarin words for things like king, for instance. Guo Wang is a word that existed before the 19th century in Chinese, but it wasn't used in quite the way that it's used now. And the way that it's used now, it's basically used the way the European word king is used.
Interesting. So do you think this is probably a question where both answers are yes, but do you think it's to give it a Western flavor or to give it it could be anywhere flavor?
I think it's like a could be anywhere. I mean, I don't know, right? I have no clue. I feel like, in some sense I need to give some caveats because, I feel like I know something about this stuff, but like I said before, somebody please tell me if you think that I've made a mistake here. But my impression is, at least, is that it's, it sort of gives it this anywhere feel. It gives it this sense that, it could be China or it could be somewhere else. And it sort of reads like a modern fable, not like an old fable, if that makes any sense.
I suppose that's a strength of the term Guo Wang. That could be emperor, could be king. But in English, well, I just said it. If you say emperor, unless it's Rome, you probably mean Japan or China or maybe somewhere else in Asia. If you say king, it's probably going to mean somewhere in Europe. So I guess that doesn't say anything particular about Chinese, but just quirks between languages. It's an interesting thing. Another question related to that, you've already mentioned like the vocabulary being used. Is there any particular historical feel to the vocabulary? Like, is it being archaic at all, or is it very standard and neutral?
No, it's very neutral. And in fact, the only really specific in time sort of words that are used are science words. So there are some moments where a sort of science word comes up, and it sounds very modern the way the science words are used, but then it sort of mixes in with the like kind of more neutrally sort of the neutral feel of some of the other stuff.
Interesting. And last thing, so I've tried to make this a feature on a show, but I keep forgetting. It's word of the day. Now, I was going to ask you to teach listeners who don't know the word for robot. I would have done this myself. I used to know this word, and I have like a few half-remembered memories, but they're gone now. So what's Mandarin for robot?
机器人.
Jīqìrén, three
Yeah.
characters. So Ren, that would be person. Ji, is that machine?
机器 is machine. Yeah.
Ji is machine. Okay. Jīqìrén. Thank you. Another translation kind of question. So this is another one that is related to storytelling robot versus the robot who like to tell tall tales. About the English versions, so the storytelling robot, that's translated by Alec Ash, and he's up against strong competition because the robot who like to tell tall tales, that's translated by Ken Leo, who is effectively kind of your luxury is not the word. What is the word? Prime foremost?
Most famous.
Well, yeah, there you go. That would do it. He's the guy for translating Chinese sci-fi. So my kind of impression was both the translations are good. They both read well for me as an English reader. But glancing over, it seems like Ken Leo's prose has a bit more flourish, maybe in the sentence syntax, and he seems to be using a wider vocab range. But I didn't really actually feel a difference as a reader. They're both pretty immersive. Did you feel any difference or have any comment on that?
I think it's an interesting observation. I think they're both very skilled. I think in a way I almost feel like the storytelling robot, the original, is simpler, and so there's this like it almost is just the fact that the original it's almost more of a difference in the original rather than a difference of translating style.
That makes sense.
I haven't read very many of Alec Ash's translations, so I don't really know if I have a sense of what his sort of style is or anything like that. But I did think about sort of whether I thought he did a good job or not, and I think he did. I think he did a great job. I mean, I think it really captures the kind of like simplicity of the original because it's sort of it's simple, but it also has a flow. It also has a good rhythm that I think he gets. And Ken Liu is really, really great. I have a lot of compliments to pay to him.
Yeah, I've read one other story translated by Alec Ash by Fei Dao. Well, the only other Alec Ash translation I've read is another Fei Dao story. It's that one I mentioned before, an end of day story, the one that's available on China Channel and Paper Republic. And I just remembered I read another one yesterday. It is in the Reincarnated Giant anthology, which is a really good one, but is a bit pricey. So it's probably probably not as well distributed as the two Ken Leo anthologies. But there is also a PDF of this story online somewhere. It's The Demon's Head, which is by a completely different translator, also by Fei Dao. I won't go into that. Suffice to say, that's a good story too, also well translated. And completely not segueing at all, jumping back to the Clark's World comments about the Tall Tales story again. One user felt that there was a lot of illusions at play in the robot who liked to tell tall tales, and he listed a few of them, and it was very diverse. Some were Western. I think most were Western. Some were Chinese. So in the storytelling robot, like I said, I thought there was maybe a reference to Schrodinger's cat, but that was the only direct possible reference to anything I picked up. Do you feel there's any direct references to anything? Like if you were editing or publishing this, would you add any footnotes, or do you think it's kind of not pinpointing anything directly?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. My thought is that if we could pin down what Fei Dao's sort of inspiration was, that would be pretty cool. But even if you can't, I think there's a lot of similarity. There's just enormous similarity with some of the stuff that we've mentioned, but in particular, Stanislaw Lem's stories about robots. There's a really interesting thing that happens here too, where robot, the word robot in English comes from another Polish writer, and for whatever reason, I really am going to butcher his name if I try to say it, but
it's okay. It's not a Polish podcast.
TrChFic or something like that.
Okay.
But in any case, there's a strange association between sort of Polish science fiction and robots. It's not like it's just like a coincidence, because of course the idea of a mechanical person or a kind of artificial person is older than the word robot. But I don't know. I think this is an interesting thing there where, footnotes I might add would have to do with robots, and like other sort of robot stories, and it would also have
Right.
to do with other sorts of Chinese stories like we've mentioned.
Sure.
Yeah, and
Cool.
I think the robot who tells tall tales probably could get a lot of footnotes because
Oh
there's
yeah.
lines in that make me think of like zhuangzi or or even kung fu stories.
Mm.
Because of the way that the robot is like this sort of adventurer who like goes off into the world to like try to seek to sort of fulfill a quest, you know?
Yes. There's something I must ask. So there's a bit in The Robot Who Liked to Tell Tall Tales where the robot meets Mr. Cat, a cat fishing by the
Ah,
river. Do you remember that?
yes.
Is that in the Chinese? Is that just, have you read the Chinese version of
I
that one?
haven't read the Chinese of that
Uh,
one. I'm
so
sorry.
I think I know how to say that in Mandarin. Mao Xiansheng, Cat Mister, Mr. Cat. Do you think there's that's a reference, or it's just supposed to be crazy?
Well, there's a couple things that come to mind really right away. One, of course, is Lewis Carroll, and I think like
Yes.
it's all it's certainly possible that Lewis Carroll, I mean, people like Lewis Carroll and Borges are certainly known in China, and like stories of those sort of strange, modern, fantastical, philosophical stories are certainly known in China.
Mm.
So, you know, that comes to mind, especially Lewis Carroll. And then like the other thing is Mao Changji, which is a Lao She novel
Ah,
called Cat Country or
Cat Country. Yes,
something like that in English. And
it's Cat Country.
yeah, and it's a so Lao She is a very one of the most famous 20th century Chinese authors of fiction and literary figures, and he's like a really a giant in the literary history of the 20th century in China. And Mao Chengji is a science fiction story that he wrote about this sort of city of cats on Mars that is a very thinly veiled allegory for China itself and the
Mm.
way that China is sort of humiliated by the West. This city of cats is like humiliated by its enemies, and the cats are all addicted to this thing that's definitely not opium. And
Catnip.
yeah, and so I don't know. I mean, the cats are sort of connected to science fiction. It's also weirdly connected to modernity because I also thought of there's a famous Japanese story called "I Am a Cat" by Natsume Soseki,
Okay.
and that was published in the 1890s. It's one of the more famous modern Japanese short stories. It's very associated with like the coming of modernity to Japan and the coming of modernity to Asia. So I don't know. I mean, I have all these associations with things. I don't know how, if any of them are things that Fei Dao would have thought of. Certainly
Mm.
he's like a smart, well-read guy. Who knows? Like probably something totally other thing that I haven't thought of.
What a good answer to a frivolous question. I think I stumbled across a finding, I suppose, of my dissertation for my master's, which was I did recently and was on Chinese sci-fi from a publishing angle. Was so I learned about all the range of Chinese sci-fi out there. So there's your early Qing stuff. There's the kind of stuff written under Mao, the communist stuff, just pro-government communist stuff, Soviet influenced, and then the new wave of stuff beginning in like the 80s and 90s up to now. And the stuff that exists in translation, essentially, with a few exceptions, it's everything that Ken Leo has touched, and then more and more stuff coming through Clark's world. But Cat Country is like the weird odd one out. It's a much older book, and it exists as a Penguin classic of some sort, and isn't really marketed as a sci-fi book, I suppose, because it's a Penguin classic. It's just a piece of it's one of the little lucky pieces of great Chinese literature that a big Western publisher has decided to put in one of their lists.
It's a great way to describe it.
Yeah, so I think it might be. I don't know how much of an oddity it is in Chinese sci-fi or Chinese literature. It's certainly an oddity in C to E, Chinese to English publishing. But yeah, it's
I,
good that you mentioned it.
I think it's, you know, in a certain way, it's actually very representative because
Mm.
science fiction in a lot of parts of the world has long been associated with like social commentary and with sort of making points about society as it is around us. You know, Jules Verne certainly did this, and Frankenstein certainly does this, but also like H.G. Wells, like, you know, H.G. Wells has a book about airship war, you know, that kind of,
Yeah,
or even War of the Worlds, or
which is on a new adaptations on BBC right now.
really, oh, that's so
Yeah,
cool. I had no
they're
idea.
2 episodes in now, I think.
Oh man, that's awesome.
Mm.
If you're listening, you know, Netflix or whoever, you should really bring that to the States.
I'm willing to bet that's going to reach streaming. somewhere.
I hope so. That's so cool. What a great idea to adapt that again. But yeah, so science fiction is like has often been associated, and also there's sort of less well-known science fiction that was famous in its time that has sort of been forgotten, like Edward Bellamy's I don't remember what it's called. It's called like Looking Backward. Yeah, that's it. Looking Backward was a story he wrote in the Victorian era about this far future utopia. And it's full of social commentary. And then there's another famous British socialist wrote a sort of utopian sci-fi story that was making points about socialism and stuff in the Victorian era. And there's a lot of that sort of thing that predates, that sort of is right around the time that China is first starting to that Chinese scholars are first starting to translate a lot of European literature into Chinese. And I know that, guys like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells were certainly translated, and people like Lu Xun were reading that, and that was kind of, when you read like Diary of a Madman or something, which I know you've done on your show, like
episode 1.
Yeah. I mean, that story is not really science fiction at all, but it's not that different from a story that's set in like a future place involving, imagine if you had the same story, but instead of it being this potential bout of madness, it was somehow related to like, he was being controlled by some technological like bracelet device or whatever. You could imagine it. Very small change to that story would make it feel way more science fictional, and that's all you would need.
Yeah,
and
unreal and dystopian.
Yeah, and there's other Chinese stories that were written like around the New Culture movement and stuff, or in the 1920s that are kind of like that have the quality of kind of being like Diary of a Madman or whatever, and they just happen to be slightly more science fictional, or they're very explicitly science fictional. And then Mao Chengdi, I think, kind of fits into that sort of era, that kind of tradition.
I was watching on YouTube a documentary about Lovecraft, because I just finished reading first time I ever read a collection of his stories, and I guess I already knew this, but I didn't know to the extent it was true, how badly kind of disregarded or maligned science fiction was, or weird fiction or horror at the time he was writing. So obviously some things, maybe they survive in publishing or in memory by being categorized as literature and not sci-fi, fantasy, and so on. I think that podcast that YouTube documentary is saying something similar to what you're saying there.
Oh, that is a wonderful point. I really like that point, and I feel like I could talk about that for ages. But it does remind me, there's a modern Chinese author that I'm not sure you've discussed on your show before. His name is Wang Xiaobo, and Wang Xiaobo he wrote in like the 80s and 90s, and he passed away in the late 90s. So he's pretty modern. He's considered like by a lot of people a sort of literary figure, like almost like a Wang Shuo type. But he wrote stuff that's like pretty science fictional. And it just so happens that people like don't typically think of him as a science fiction author. But I think if you like read it, it's, I don't know. I mean, there's these interesting things that happen where certain authors, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a classic example, because that's the kind of thing at least in the States, we read that, and people have to read that in high school or middle school or something. It's like assigned a lot,
First year of uni is when I read it.
Yeah, and there's so many movies and whatever, adaptations or parodies or what have you. But and it sort of has the status of being this like just like a book that's famous and old, but like it's totally science fiction. Like, it's about this scientist who creates the thing, and it's sort of, I don't know. There's an interesting way that things get categorized arbitrarily. And
I think in film that's a horror, and it has horror elements in the book. But yeah, there's sci-fi stuff there as well.
But then, of course, it's also the subtitle is A Modern Prometheus, and so it has this mythological connection. Right. Anyway, we could go on and on about this.
We could, yeah, you're absolutely right. And if time was infinite, we should. But it's not. So let's go on to our last segment. This is questions about, well, your own endeavors, let's say, and your connection with science fiction. So, first question: when did you first really connect with science fiction?
Oh yeah, well I'm one of those geeks who as a kid, I mean, I was reading this when I think my father showed me Star Wars when I was 6 or something like that, like the first one, the original that came out, and I've always loved things that are science fiction or fantasy stories. So it's just kind of my whole, as long as I can remember, different ages, I've read different things, and it's always been something I loved. So it's something it's one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast, Spectology, with my friend Adrian, because both of us had that experience. We both kind of grew up with it, and it kind of was always something that was important to us. And when it was Adrian's idea, when Adrian realized, oh yeah, like why don't we could actually do a podcast and it could be like this and so on, I was, it was like I just thought it was a terrific idea.
Right. That's interesting. Do you have like a foundational author, like a first sci-fi author you really were into, or not so much?
Maybe Isaac Asimov.
Okay.
And ironically enough, the Foundation books. I mean, there's other stuff that I read as a kid, definitely. But I think that I really liked Isaac Asimov when I was little. I read his autobiography when I was a kid, which is like a weird thing to do, but I just thought he was so cool and interesting when I was little. And he wrote so many books in his life, and he wrote about a lot of things other than science fiction, actually. He wrote a lot of nonfiction. When I was young, I read he has this book that's, you know how like sometimes people write these like popular science books that are like a history of the universe or something? He has one of those. I read that, and I just read a lot of his books, his robot books, his Foundation books, his other stories. Can
you tell me, the one I read by him, I don't remember the name, it's about connections with another world where people are like amoebas or something. Half the book is about the human end, and the other half is about these like cell type creatures who have like 3 genders. Do you remember that?
Oh man, I don't, but
I'm probably horribly.
It's been a while since I read some of his stuff. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I think
I'll probably edit that question out.
No, it's all right. I also should mention I totally love Ursula K. Le Guin. I read The Wizard of Earthsea, which is not really science fiction, but it's fantasy, I suppose. It's all speculative fiction, I guess, in some sense. But I read that when I was little, and she, I think, is just a genius, and like everything she touches is great. And I think Isaac Asimov has this property that a lot of his work doesn't hold up as well when you get older. Some of it does, but some of it doesn't. It's not that it's like super, I don't know. I mean, it just there's different problems with different stories and certain things.
Okay.
But Ursula K. Le Guin, I think I actually just appreciate her more and more as I get older. And so, yeah, she's like another amazing, like, very influential figure to me.
I can say as a kid, I had a Wizard of Earthsea that I was given along with a bunch of other books for books marketed for kids of all sorts of different genres. And this was me fresh out of like Harry Potter and that whole wave of books. And Wizard of Earthsea, I think I finished it, but I really wasn't that into it. And then I reread that whole series just a year or two ago as an adult, and I was like, yeah, this is actually pretty good. But I feel like those for me anyway, they worked better as a mature adult than as a kid, because they avoid a lot of like the flash and bang excitement. So in that way, yeah.
I think you're right. I mean, I more or less had the same experience when I was little. I thought it was sort of interesting and like it made me feel feelings, but I only as an adult do I sort of, actually it's been a while since I reread them, and I really want to do that again, because I feel like I usually never reread things, but her work is stuff I want to, because I feel like I'll get something new out of it.
I saw a thing when I was doing my Folding Beijing episode. I saw Goodreads had a book by her that looked like it might be in English. It had reviews in English, but I think it's only been translated obviously in Chinese, but I think it's in German or French or something. I think German. And it's a story where it says like there's a half of humanity or something have made a colony on Mars. Earth has the remainder of the population. One is capitalist, one is socialist. And I thought, wait a minute, hang on. This is this is The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. So I've not looked into that more, and maybe can't unless I learn German or Chinese. But have you heard anything about that book?
About The Dispossessed, or
no, about Hao Jinfan's version?
No. Sorry, I was. I haven't, and I really. She's another modern author who I think is just amazing. I think Folding Beijing is an incredible story, and but I actually haven't. That's the only story of hers that I've read, and I really need to read more of her.
I'm about to read my second Hao Jinfang's story as I'm working through Broken Stars. But yeah, I might message you about that later. Maybe the Goodreads link to the thing for the German version.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, it's certainly intriguing because I don't think any of the comments mentioned the Dispossessed, which left me there, kind of staring at the computer screen, going, "Guys, guys!" But I didn't leave a comment. I'll let them figure that out for themselves. So I've asked you about your foundation in sci-fi as a whole. How about your first Chinese sci-fi? What was the first Chinese sci-fi that you came across?
Oh, that's a tough one. I'm not sure. I think it might have been something in the New Culture movement. Because I started reading Chinese literature in university, and I read a lot of different things in different genres that were just assigned to me.
Right.
And I seem to remember there was one that was about space travel, and I don't remember. But to be honest, I don't really remember. And at some point after that, I sort of started looking around for different things, and I found some stories here and there. And then when I was a student in China at one point, I was taking. I don't remember. See, a lot of these details escape me. But in any case, I don't remember if it was for a class or not. But I got this reader. It's like a university reader. For Chinese students who are studying like literature. And that book was just like a treasure trove. It has all these different kinds of stories, and it has a bunch of translations of. It has a translation of Victor Hugo short story. It has a translation of Borges into Chinese, and like it has a bunch of strange Chinese stories. And then I got really into older Chinese stories, stuff from like these sort of old anthologies of different kinds of writing. Some of them very old, some of them medieval, some of them sort of more recent, like Strange Tales from Chinese Studio. And I sort of read a lot of those, and I actually read a lot more of that kind of stuff before I sort of started reading more modern stuff only a little bit later. And then at some point in the last few years, I started getting more into Chinese science fiction through like what I try to do is sort of find whoever I can find who I think sounds interesting, and then look into that author. I try to do it kind of like that. I'm sorry, I don't have like a more sort of clear kind of origin story there.
Well, I think it begs another question. When did you first read Three Body, if you've read that?
I've actually not read Three Body, which is astonishing. I know. I've been meaning to read it in Chinese, and that is the kind of problem that I have, because it'll take me a while to read it in Chinese, just because I read Chinese much more slowly than I read English. And so I keep putting it off because it's sort of more of a commitment, which
it's
sucks.
A trilogy, and it's like Harry Potter. I think the books get bigger and bigger.
Yeah, I picked them up and I have them, and I just need to actually do it. So I started the first one, but it's a commitment. So
it is.
I need to actually do that.
I think when I first read them, it was actually the only time I've read them. It was in an ebook form. So I read the first one very quickly, second one a little bit longer, and then the start of the third one, I have no physical book in front of me, so I had no idea what a monster it was. But it's fine. I was enjoying it so much, and I was like, oh, good, more book. Great, it'll never end. And then, of course, finally it does. So here's a question that follows on from that. Do you have plans to cover more Chinese sci-fi on your show, Spectology?
Absolutely. Definitely we want to do that. There's so much out there. It's so fun for us to do. Adrian and I are both really interested in it. We try really hard to kind of pick a wide range of things, especially stuff that we think that our readers might really like, but that they might not have heard of before. So we try to shy away from the most well-known stuff that's already super famous. So you probably won't ever see us doing like the Expanse books, or like an Alistair Reynolds book, or like something like that. Although, every now and then, so for instance, this December, we're doing a special kind of special one-off month of classic sci-fi books, where we're doing older books, which we usually do newer books. But among those will be a couple that people will have heard of. Definitely, there's an Arthur C. Clarke book, for example, and a Samuel Delany book, and people have probably heard of those guys if they're science fiction fans. But in general, we try to do a wide range of things, and so we're definitely going to be trying to cover more China stuff. among the other range of things we want to do. And if you have any suggestions, send them my way.
Oh, so many. Have you read Invisible Planets or Broken Stars?
Yes.
Both, right.
Big fan.
Yeah. Well, I guess the kind of slightly hidden third book, not that it's published by the same people, but if you're willing to splash a bit of cash, there's also that the Reincarnated Giant anthology. It's a lot more of the same, but it's by lots of different stories by lots of different translators. But it's a similar range of authors. That one's it's on Amazon, and the publisher is, I think, the China University Press of the Chinese University in Hong Kong. There could be more gold in there for you.
I definitely want to check that book out. I have not read that one, and I as soon as you mentioned it earlier in this episode, I kind of like took note because that's definitely something I want to check out. But even Invisible Planets or Broken Stars those are things that we could conceivably do. It might be a few months before we do another Chinese sci-fi book, just because this past year we've done not only Waste Tide, but we also did it's not Chinese, but we did a book of short stories already. So it might be a bit before we do another book of short stories.
Okay, makes sense. For similar reasons to you, wanting to avoid stuff that already has had a lot of coverage. That's why I haven't tried to do a 3-body problem episode. Not that it's vastly well known in sci-fi, but for Chinese books, there's already other podcasts that have done that book. So I am going to do Liu Cixin, but it'll be one of his short stories.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. There's a clue for listeners who haven't seen. I did a Twitter post where I put one Chinese character, one emoji for all the upcoming episodes. So for this one, we did not have our episode picked yet, so there's nothing. But for all the other ones, there are clues, and I'm quite pleased with them.
I love it.
Yeah, smug. I'm smug about my Twitter posts. We've already talked about how your show works, so I'll skip that question. This is the very last question. So when we were communicating before this recording, we both noted that we'd missed a chance to ask Chen Qiufan about anime influences in his book in Waste Tide. So this is something I didn't talk about in my last episode, but just because I forgot to write it down in my questions for Qiufan. So the stuff that made me think of influences from Japan in his book, as a younger Chinese sci-fi writer who's maybe has got these influences in a way some of the older ones don't. There was a lot of mention of tentacles. I won't go too deep on that, but there's a lot of tentacles in Waste Tide.
I shouldn't laugh because that's not like a funny part of the book.
No. But in the context of this question, it's very funny. And then there's your co-host Adrian. He picked up on a reference to Neon Genesis Evangelion. There's a big mecha robot called Eva, and I think in Waste Tide it says the name of this robot or this mecha suit was taken from a popular anime. And if anyone's seen Akira, the film, or Neon Genesis, kind of the power politics, the dystopian stuff, the magical powers. Oh no, what's her name? The girl. Mimi, yes, the magical kind of powers Mimi acquires. It's all kind of there in like a big soup. Did you have any? Did you spot any other things, or do you have any thoughts that I've not given voice to about the anime influence in Waste Tide?
Yeah, I definitely think it's there. I wish. Yeah, there's a lot to cover here. I also have a very big interest in Japan and Japanese fiction and science fiction. And we in another episode we covered an old classic of Japanese science fiction called 10 Billion Days and 100 Billion Nights, and it's a terrific book that I love. But there's so much there. I think if you're interested, like anime is like a great way to get into the Japanese science fiction world, which is like a very cool space where they have a lot of different kinds of ideas and stories that you may not be able to find elsewhere. And it's great because anime, people often, just like with film anywhere, people make anime out of novels, sometimes out of light novels, out of comics, out of other sources. or just out of nothing, or it's original to the anime, and like Evangelion is. But so you can kind of really use anime as an entree into Japanese science fiction, I think, and it's popular everywhere. It's not just popular in English. Anime is incredibly big in China. It has been for a long time.
Something I did not expect before I went there. Wasn't really expecting like the cuteness culture, kawaii culture.
Yeah.
But it's everywhere in China, and I guess lots of countries near Japan. And it's more. I feel like it's more normal there than it is here. Like when I was in school, I wasn't an anime kid, but you could spot the kids who were very easily. They were the misfits. Right. Whereas in China, like I suppose it is a bit of a nerd thing, but it's not. It's very normalized, like the cuteness stuff.
Yeah, I think it's almost like how it is in Japan, where you know, there are people who are sort of really into it, or really into one in particular, or really into like a lot of anime. But even people who aren't, there's probably like one or two they like. You know what I mean? So
yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Especially because there are anime about sports. There are anime about like super sort of, you know, mainstream kinds of stories. And
those ones didn't reach the kids my age growing up on UK TV. We just got like Pokemon, Digimon, fighting explosions and stuff.
Yeah. And then there's like the ones that are for children, where there's like Doraemon is like it's an anime for children. It's very popular worldwide. It's big in Indonesia. It's big in India. It's
all over Bangkok in Thailand.
Yeah, it's huge. It's a worldwide phenomenon, but it's sort of not really in America, and maybe it's not in the UK either.
No, not at all.
Yeah,
no.
Yeah. So I mean, it is now, I guess, but when I was a kid, it wasn't. I don't remember it at all. So there's these interesting kind of different animes, different levels of popularity in different places thing. But yeah, I think it's all over Waist Tide, and I think especially cyberpunk. There's another one, Ghost in the Shell.
Why did I not mention that? Yes.
Yeah, I meant to mention that myself, but that's another one from the 90s that seems like a pretty obvious influence.
I mentioned that on a previous episode. It was the interview with Dylan Levi King, the translator, and it was on the similar topic of like looking at connections between China and its neighboring countries from the perspective of a Westerner. And like, I don't know, not really, again, no deep thoughts, just, this is very interesting. Because obviously, like being a European, there are lots of smallish countries next to each other. They're all kind of similar, and they have interplay between each other. And being an ignorant Westerner, you don't maybe really think about how other regions of the world do the exact same thing. The cultural dialogue between China and its neighbors, or Japan and its neighbors. Again, I have no question there. I have no deep thoughts. It's just a recurring theme of this podcast because it's something me, the host, is intellectually tickled by.
Yeah. Well, I think if people are listening to this podcast, they probably find you interesting. So that's good.
I hope so. I hope so. Yeah. On that very nice compliment from you, I'll probably wrap it up. We've been going quite a while now.
Oh, yeah. Time flies when you're having fun.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's been a pleasure having you on the show, Matt. Do you want to plug your podcast or anything else one last time before we say bye-bye?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, mentioned a bunch, but Spectology, science fiction podcast, book club podcast, with me and my co-host Adrian. Adrian handles a lot of social media so that I don't have to. So we have a Twitter, and you can there's an email, and our podcast is available on all kinds of podcast platforms all over the place. So wherever you like to listen to it, you can find it, and I hope you do so. There you go. So on that note, thank you so much for being on the show, Matt. You're welcome back anytime. Well, not the next episode. That would be weird. But welcome back on the future. That would be fab. I'm sure more Chinese sci-fi or just more Chinese literature that's interesting to you might pop up. If I end up doing these weird stories like the Su Pong, it can't be Pongling. Pu Songling, yeah. Pu Songling, yes. If I end up doing him, I might zap you a message if that sounds fun. I would love to do. That's a great book. And that would be a good one because I can do lots of wee stories, and then I can have yourself and others. So yeah, it could be a winning strategy. Well, it's been an enormous pleasure. I feel like a bit like the odd one out, because you've had such interesting and well-known people involved in this space on the show already, like Zhang Qiufan or many others. So I thank you for inviting me. Well, you're the first podcaster who's been a guest, so they're probably jealous of your audio skills. That's very funny if you knew how few of those I had.
Or you got a good podcast voice as well, and not everyone's got one of those.
Why? Thank you. Flattery will get you everywhere.
Yeah, there you go. On that note, I'm going to stop the recording.
So, all in all, a really excellent chat there, I would say. Thank you so much again to Matt for being on the show. So, something I've looked up following the conversation is that Hao Jingfang book that I mentioned, her kind of take, as it were, on Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed. And it turns out that in August we had some exciting news about that particular novel. It's going to find its way into English via a translation from Ken Liu. It seems like its old working English title had been Stray Skies, which is a fairly literal translation of the original Chinese, although nice and alliterated. But the title it's going to be published under in English is Vagabonds, and you can already pre-order it as a book, and a print book and an ebook. I believe in the UK, I think what's going to happen is UK and worldwide Head of Zeus are publishing, except in North America. There it will be Simon & Schuster, not Tor, from what I could gather. So it's another sign that Head of Zeus is really becoming the kind of Ken Liu / Chinese sci-fi HQ, and they're kind of outpacing Tor in their dedication to being a publisher of Chinese sci-fi, or at least that's my kind of I won't say pro UK, not too big of a fan of the UK, but my anti-America takes the lead on everything take on that as a publisher. Hope I'm not aggravating my North American listeners in saying that. I'm really waffling now, so let's just do the final plugs. Do check out the show's Instagram at TrChFic, my Twitter, Angus Likes Words. I've been posting on that more than the Instagram recently. I should try and correct that. And of course, if you wish to materially support the show, you can do so via Patreon and get access to bonus content or as a one-off on Buy Me a Coffee. All links in the show notes. But of course, the most powerful way in which you can help the show is by telling people who might like it. Tell your friends, tell your dog, tell your storytelling robot, tell the king, but don't frustrate him by leaving a cliffhanger on whatever it is you're telling him. That would just be mean, very mean and very dramatic, which we can't be having. And yeah, that's what you can do. Until next episode, 再见.
再见我开路呀